Hello.
Hi.
Welcome to your library at home. My name is Rebecca and I work at the public programs team of the State Library of New South Wales. It gives me great pleasure this evening to be introducing our author talk with Deborah Cassrels in conversation with Roger Maynard, talking about her book, Gods and Demons. She'll be discussing the hidden side to the mystical Hindu paradise, vast Indonesian archipelago, in which all is not as it seems. I would like to begin this event this evening by acknowledging also that the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of this land on which knowledge has been exchanged for millennia. We also celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal culture and language across New South Wales, and I take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and especially emerging. And I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us today. Before I hand over to Deborah and Roger, I would like to mention that, as always, we are using the Q&A feature of the Zoom account, which you can see down below. And I encourage you all to submit your questions throughout the talk, and Roger and Deborah will make time at the end of this hour to answer as many of those questions as possible. So it gives me great pleasure now to welcome to your screens both Deborah and Roger, and I will certainly be handing over to them now to finish that conversation for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just waiting for Roger to join us here. Thanks, Roger.
Hello.
Thank you.
We're together now. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'll hand over to you both now, and thank you to everyone online for joining us this evening.
Thank you, and I apologize for the few minutes delay there. Anyway, thank you very much indeed to Deborah and to all those of you who are listening and looking online. I have to say, I've read Gods and Demons 2 or 3 times now, and every time I get something new out of it. It's a really exceptionally good read in lots and lots of different ways. I'd like to start this interview by quoting from the very first paragraph of the first chapter in Deborah's book, which in many ways sums up how Deborah felt at the time of her departure from Australia for Bali. She wrote, "I didn't travel to Indonesia with high expectations. Rather, it was in the spirit of hospitality, in the spirit of possibility, self-preservation, adventure, and an abiding interest in the unknown. I had worked in many countries, and it was in this peripatetic vein that I set out," she said. Well, now, Deborah, you went on to spend nearly a decade in Indonesia, based in Bali for the Australian newspaper. Did it turn out as you expected?
Well, Roger, I really didn't know what to expect, to be honest. And I think that was the attraction. I just wanted to sort of cast myself into this unknown place, really. I felt I was in limbo, and that if things sort of fell in a heap, I could always leave. But and I had this finite list of stories that I'd come with, and they just kept proliferating, and they became ever more fascinating as I went on. Indonesia is such an eye-opener, and it just sort of kept on giving.
What actually prompted you to go there, Deborah?
I first visited in 2006 as an escape from my relationship breakdown. And I really fell for Bali, like most tourists. The tropical environment, the people, the culture was so alluring. And it was quiet and peaceful, just what I needed, really. But what I didn't know was that calmness was an aberration triggered by the second Bali bombing in 2005. Tourists had abandoned the island, and it was economically ravaged, especially on the back of the 2002 bombs. So on a couple of subsequent visits, I was you know, I was quite hooked by then. I visited Karabakan jail and I interviewed some of the Bali 9 drug gang. There was a substantial amount of interest, and from there my Indonesian career more or less took off. By the time I based myself there in 2009, the tourists had flocked back. I loved the carefree expat lifestyle, sort of juxtaposed with a serious side in courtrooms and police stations. And it all seemed very exotic.
And then what prompted you to write the book, and at what stage did you decide to write the book?
I was first approached by my publisher HarperCollins some years ago, but my schedule was hectic and I really felt I didn't have enough material in any sense of the word. You know, it was going to be a memoir. The book remained on the back burner till about 2018 while I sort of chased these other compelling stories all over the place, you know, all over Indonesia on things like refugees and trafficking and terrorism, and then sort of very offbeat topics on faraway islands, which were fabulous, and that it all offered this sort of relatively instant gratification and lots of intrigue. It was really a dream job, and I didn't really feel like giving that away to sit behind a desk. But by the time I did sit at that desk, I felt I had amassed material at least worthy of a book. Yeah, the book depicts some of the stories that impacted me the most. It's really a transformative journey and an impressionistic perspective of the country. And as you say, it capped a decade of corresponding from Indonesia.
Tell us what are some of your most vivid memories of that 9 or 10 years looking back now?
I guess everything was an incredible novelty, and it always was. There was always this vibrancy, the sort of sharpness of colours, the joy of finding that each island was almost like another country with different customs and beliefs and all, you know, colourful characters. And in Bali, there was this spontaneity, but also a weird quirkiness to the way things functioned or didn't function. And there was this jam correct, which means rubber time, for instance. And that really means that people work to their own clocks. Nobody's punctual and meetings can just evaporate, which is obviously anathema to a journalist. But the most indelible and enduring story was that of the Bali 9 heroin smugglers, and that continues. So whatever assignments I was away doing, I would come back to that one because there was always another appeal, there was always another trial. It seems to me now incredible that these 5 Australian men remain on life sentences after nearly 16 years. It'll be 16 years this year in prison. But it seems that there's a bit of a glimmer of hope for them. There was a report in the Australian the other day about a bipartisan push by 2 federal MPs for clemency on compassionate and humane grounds. So we'll see what happens. It's you know, it's very hard to say what can happen because it's a pretty tricky.
It was obviously a very traumatic time for you, covering the Bali 9 trials. How close did you become with, or how close were you to those young people, particularly those who were eventually sentenced to death?
Yeah, well, I did get to know them all variously, and but I guess I knew Scott Rush and Myron Sukumaran, who was executed the best. I visited Scott many times, especially when he was transferred to a remote East Bali prison in 2014. He was incredibly depressed and lonely, and he was the only Western prisoner there. But he was also, you know, a very charismatic, or is a very charismatic and curious guy, and we would have these long chats. I knew Myron Sukumaran better than Andrew Chan, who became a pastor in jail, and then Myron became a talented artist, and he was obsessed with expanding his arts programs for inmates. And we would talk a lot about that and art, because I have a particular love of art as well. The programs actually helped him cope, and long before his clemency was rejected, well, maybe a year or two actually before that, he told me that he had to stay busy all the time, every waking moment, to stop him thinking about the death sentence hanging over him. And he explained this actually packed daily routine, which included studying for a fine arts degree.
What was that the hardest of the stories you covered, or were there others as well?
I would say that was the hardest. Definitely, it was the most confronting and challenging story of my career, really, my whole career, particularly because I knew them. And it was impossible not to be consumed by this story, because I reported on it for 4 months, day in and day out. And actually, I developed quite an unhealthy obsession. I'd sort of wake in the night with a sense of foreboding, and then be immersed as soon as I woke up. And I was really among few foreign correspondents to cover it until the end, because most of the media, and there was, you know, there were just huge amounts of media, Australian media, parachuted in for a month, which is the period of their visas, and then they would get replaced. So, you know, they would have some respite from this, you know, pretty gruesome ongoing story. Yeah, I was very close to the story from the beginning. When Myron learnt of his clemency bid being rejected, I was sort of an unwitting confidant, and I'd been primed for a year to do an arts piece with Myron and his mentor, the artist Ben Quilty. But that story overnight turned into this chilling front page news, as the first batch of drug convicts were about to be executed. And that particular night, we talked on the phone when this news broke that they were probably next in line for the firing squad. He was in absolute shock, but, you know, with all this emotional rawness, he was grief-stricken and, you know, panicked and terrified and totally concerned for his family. I mean, he told me about how he had developed an eating disorder, and he's walking around crying all the time. He didn't know what to do with himself. It was an extremely difficult interview, because I get, you know, I just, how do you console someone who's headed for the firing squad? What do you say? And I guess the best I could do was listen. It was a roller coaster from the beginning to end, because there were multiple scheduled changes, diplomatic ructions and transfer delays to the execution island, Nusa Kambangan, and last-ditch appeals. And I was in the midst of this surreal storm, and it was particularly bizarre because outside of work, this happy tourist world of Bali kept spinning. It seemed very farcical.
Being so personally involved in that story, was it difficult to detach yourself when going back to your home or wherever in the night to write the story. I mean, how did you do that? How did you actually get down and write a story for the Australian?
No, it wasn't really difficult, because it was, I think you become objective, and I think a lot of journalists say this about, you know, when they're in war zones or particularly traumatic circumstances, which, you know, you kind of switch to that sort of remote control and you just get on with it. And I think it was only when I would have, I do remember that driving my car to various interviews, and I would have just a few moments to reflect, and that's when it would hit me, and I would become quite emotional. But other than that, the actual working on it was very kind of, I have to say, mechanical. It was a breaking story, you know, many times a day, often, you know, not just daily. But so it was, yeah, just how you would treat, a journalist would treat any sort of breaking story. You somehow have this mechanism that makes you keep going.
And it was a story that carried on for a long time, and you were always with it. But there were lots of stories that just happened out of the blue, so to speak. And you talk about in your book the thrill of stories spontaneously falling into your lap while covering other ones. How do those stories come to you? Was it by accident or by design? And how would you describe those sort of stories?
I think by a certain point, I built up a really good network, and just even if you going back to Myron Sukumaran and that story, I felt I was very lucky because I had been in Bali a long time, and I had a huge network of contacts, which actually, you know, so I was sort of often on top of angles before other people. But with this other sort of serendipitous type of thing, I found that, yes, after building up a serious amount of contacts, I found Indonesia was very like that. It was like often on my travels, I would to different islands. I found anything could happen, and it usually did. And it was a very addictive type of thing. And I'd kind of randomly, on my way to do a particular interview, often run into sort of the top brass or infamous terrorists, eccentric characters, and people whose networks stretched throughout the country, uncannily involving somebody I was actually chasing. So these unexpected encounters usually formed part of my stories or led to entirely new ones. So I could get out of one particular piece that I might be writing, I sometimes got several pieces. So, and just as an example, in Jakarta once, I was chasing a terrorism story, and I had a private meeting organized, which sort of morphed into this lavish lunch in a hotel in the dining room, which was, somebody led me into this dining room through huge doors. It was full of, it was an official meeting full of officials, and I was led to the top table, and I was the only Western person in a sea of Indonesian men, and the host stood and offered me a seat sandwiched between himself and Nasir Abbas. Abbas was a former military commander who trained the Bali bombers and had turned police informant. He was obviously a real catch at that particular time for my story. And he became, over the years, a very reliable source. And he later paved the way for a seminal interview with his sister, the widow of Mukhlis, who was the actual mastermind of the 2002 Bali bombs, who he was executed for his role. But yeah, it was sort of something that stands out. and it was almost like a scene in a movie.
And we shouldn't forget that most of the time you're traveling and working by yourself in this country, and there would be a lot of frustrations along the way, particularly working in a foreign country like Indonesia. How did you cope with that sort of lifestyle, working by yourself and having to do everything yourself, basically, and not having much backup at the end of the day?
Well, I actually loved it. I loved that independence, and especially when I had those spontaneous encounters, because it would meant that I didn't have to sort of explain to anybody. I could just sort of use my antenna. Was it this going to be a good lead or not? But and I learned to really map out if I was traveling, I mapped out my interviews fairly carefully about where I was going, what I was doing before I actually did travel. And so I usually sort of had a very finely tuned routine or to follow during those travels to other places. But certainly in the early days, I had to adapt to a very strange environment in which officials did not understand the concept of deadlines. And it was very difficult finding reliable contacts as a new person. And I found it very frustrating. And, when I phoned, for instance, when I phoned officials, as I say, this is very early on, but I had no option. But when I phoned them for quotes on deadline, they were always very affable, but they'd tell me to come to their office or to call back next week. And it was just bizarre, to me. And sometimes they'd hang up in the middle of a conversation. I couldn't get my head around all this. And often they'd insist on me coming to meet them, and for morning or afternoon tea, and I'd get there and find they'd gone to a religious ceremony or they'd gone home, and that was the culture of this sort of jam karet, this rubber time, and they worked at a very slow, leisurely pace, and it didn't matter to them at all if I was on deadline. So yeah, it was intensely frustrating at that point. Look, eventually I sorted out who were decent sources, but yeah.
You mentioned some of the colourful characters and important characters you met during your time there. Anybody stand out in particular? Any particular people that you can remember vividly?
Yeah, there were quite a lot of them, but I think the most unexpected person I got to meet was Tommy Winata, who I met in 2016. And he is this contentious, enigmatic Jakarta tycoon with political and military connections, and one of the most powerful and feared people in Indonesia. He never talked to the media, and so I was extremely lucky to get this interview, and it was real pot luck, really. I interviewed him about his planned $2 billion reclamation of Bali's Benoa Bay, which is by the airport, and it was really shaping up to be a disaster to the Balinese people. But he wanted a sort of Dubai-esque mega development with artificial islands, a mini city with resorts and Disney-themed parks, and a Formula One racetrack, and it would have destroyed sacred Balinese Hindu sites and villages, and of course the environment. And this triggered just huge mass protests, and the objections have so far halted the development. It really blew up. The zoning is complex, so the issue is likely to resurface. However, at the time, interviewed Winata at his remote conservation property in South Sumatra, which was an adventure in itself, of course. He invited me there for 3 days and we flew over on his private helicopter. So it was fairly, it was quite dreamlike in a sense, because this is a sublime area with a lake, wild animals, and endangered tigers. Winata fed them live pigs, and I was treated to a special viewing, which is a picture that has stayed with me. But when we actually landed there, the first vision I had was of these armed guards on horseback and staff sort of deferentially greeting him. And it was evident that this man wielded this uncanny amount of power. But to look at him, you wouldn't know that. He wore these sort of tacky shorts and t-shirt and Crocs. And as a person, he was hospitable. He was quite open to being questioned about anything. But, you know, it didn't mean he would respond meaningfully. And sometimes his responses were bizarre and fatuous, such as, you know, one time I asked him about WikiLeaks allegations in 2011 that he was a mafia figure. And he replied, "What's mafia? Is it a cake?" So, yeah, look, I was among this pristine, dense rainforest of thousands of hectares, which Winata had regenerated from illegal fishing, logging and mining. And it was obvious that, you know, what the idea was from, but in the end, its impressiveness was incongruous because there bore no relation to the glitzy reclamation he was proposing. But I have to say that the more pressing issue for me at the time was that I was dependent on him and his helicopter to get home. So, yeah.
Do you know how he reacted to the story when it was published?
No. Well, it's a bit strange because he didn't. There was no reaction, and I didn't think I should call him and ask, because I was constantly sort of asked by his staff, or, you know, is it going to be good for Pak Tommy or Mr. Tommy? We hope it's going to be a good story. And I always said, you know, that it would be a balanced story because I told it from the Balinese point of view as well, and the protests, etc. And so, look, I took it that he wasn't particularly pleased, but there was nothing he could sort of complain about, really, you know. So to this day, I don't really know.
Perhaps better not to know.
Yeah, that's my feeling.
Let's just return to the Bali for the moment, which, to use the old cliches, is regarded as a fun-filled holiday paradise, but with the added allure of a unique Hindu culture too. You saw a very different side to Bali and the people who live there. How would you, after your 9 or 10 years in Bali, describe the island and its people?
Well, much of the landscape outside the crowded south is spectacular, but on my assignments, I traveled to remote areas, reporting on mainly dire situations. So I was in, you know, I did pass through spectacular landscape that not a lot of tourists see, but my assignments were in these very hidden areas, and I found the depiction of Bali as a beautiful paradise has become really quite hackneyed in news reports, and it has for a long time. the contrast between the plush tourist image and the reality is pretty stark. Many of the locals in my investigations were in survival mode, and you know, it was quite horrific, their situations. They live in abject poverty. They're sort of cut off from proper medical facilities and education. Many live in basic huts with no electricity, running water or sanitation. On some of my assignments, I found leper colonies in dirt clearings, which even authorities denied, you know. And there were, you know, I interviewed victims of pedophilia, and I saw Dickensian orphanages. It's not the glossy image that most imagine Bali is. Bali is not always viewed as part of Indonesia, a developing country, where there are also, you know, there's countless migrants also seeking work on the island. Look, I found many foreigners unaware about where they were living. But of course, the government is not so keen for the tourists to see those parts anyway.
And much of what you reported on came back to crime.
Yeah.
In one unreported incident, you witnessed mob justice in Bali as a couple of horrified tourists were forced to watch this incident. What actually happened, and is this a common phenomenon in your opinion?
Yeah. I'll just say that much of crime does go unreported as well. And there are, and this sort of, there's, you know, especially if Australians are involved, then it becomes sort of front page news or major news. But there's always all sorts of things simmering in the background, like drugs and bribery, corruption, tainted alcohol, and all sorts of things, nasty things, scams. But this particular incident that I describe in my book, yeah, it is quite common. It's a sort of mob justice. I describe a scene that goes really to the heart of the dark side, where two young Australian tourists are caught up in a violent scene involving a bunch of Balinese gangsters in the car park of my own villa compound. I found them there after a man had tried to snatch the woman's handbag in the adjoining laneway, and I just happened to be parking my car. It was around 10 p.m. at night when all this started playing out, and the couple, these gangsters had sort of dragged in this accused thief, and the couple were kind of forced to watch this traditional punishment by these village thugs. And well, they're local vigilantes. They texted scores of their mates and they rode in on masses of bikes. And this all happened in the car park of my villa. And they kicked and beat this accused thief to death before our eyes, you know. A police officer came, turned a blind eye. This isn't an uncommon thing in Bali for stealing offences. It's and the expats all know about it. They sometimes will put incidents on social media, but other than that, it doesn't really make the news. This was so I knew, you know, a lot about it, but it was the first time I'd actually witnessed this kind of mob violence, and it was pretty awful, horrific. And I would imagine that the tourists would never return. They were just young, a young couple. Mm.
And one of the other most heartrending and distressing spectacles you came across involved the mentally ill, didn't it? In which some people were treated like animals virtually. How did this story come about?
Yeah, this was a story about shackled people in Bali, and it's not something anyone imagines on a luxury resort island. So a Bali psychiatrist who I'd known for quite a long time through other stories, she invited me on her kind of outreach visits to treat victims. They're typically schizophrenic. Many had been shackled in chains and in stocks or confined to rooms by their families for 10 to 20 years. They call them pasung victims, which means that they're kept in various forms of restraints. Yeah, it was very distressing, but I felt it was such a compelling story that needed to be told. You know, obviously, if you're a journalist, you must tell that story. It was published in the Weekend Australia magazine, and some of the pictures that I shot were extremely disturbing, and you know, they never saw the light of day, actually. It was just totally surreal to walk into a so-called normal Balinese family compound where everyone's chatting and laughing, and then suddenly you encounter this shackled person chained like an animal it's always a fetid room because they don't move them. And it really defies comprehension. The families sort of do that because they don't, first of all, they don't understand mental illness, they don't understand schizophrenia, they are afraid the victims will be violent or embarrass them even by stealing, and if they're freed. But you know, sadly, the rationale is usually about money. It's a really cheap alternative to medical treatment, which sounds bizarre, but that's the way it is. And there's also this other thing, there's a lot of stigma and karma-related superstition around a mental illness. And it's commonly believed that the victims are possessed or there's black magic involved. And I have to say, mental illness is not understood at all, even by the government. And it's not seen as a health priority because there are no funds allocated to it, or, you know, literally few funds. And this is ongoing, shackling. It's even, there is a long time government ban on it, but you know, they still do it. And there's still a few hundred victims in Bali. They're also in Java and other islands. And I also found that most expats were unaware of these people, these practices. Look, strangely, in these sorts of horrific stories, I often discovered a bit of a tenderness interwoven in them. In this case, the mothers of shackled women that I met had lived in these putrid rooms with their children who'd been knocked up for years by the fathers, and they're only released after the fathers died. So, of course, by that time, the victims were kind of catatonic. But yeah, very sad.
It's surprising, isn't it, though, because health and healing plays a very big factor in Balinese society. And of course, there are a lot of charlatans around too. In fact, I believe you encountered one of them yourself, didn't you?
Yeah. I think it really took off in a very touristy way after Elizabeth Gilbert's memoir, Eat, Pray, Love, was released in 2006, and then the film adaptation in 2010, which was set in, or partly set in Ubud's spiritual Mecca. And then, yeah, spiritual tourism really took off. And during that time, I knew who were visiting shamans or spiritual healers. I got curious and they recommended some healers who were really actually snake oil salesmen, lots of them. But I didn't really dampen my interest, because I sort of thought, well, there's got to be some authentic people out there. A Balinese friend took me to lots of different people, but one of them she introduced me to was a very renowned guy, and my friend used to host French groups who came specifically for spiritual tourism, and they'd stay a week and I'd just tag along with them. So this, I was interested in this quite renowned healer. He drew Westerners in varying stages of cancer. That was what he was known for, really. And these people were obviously very vulnerable, and they had just eschewed Western science-based treatment for this these herbal and spiritual cures. And for some of them I could see it was a last resort. And this healer was really venerated, and so much so that people genuflected to him. I found it really surprising. And when I asked a student of the healer if business had accelerated after Eat, Pray, Love, she said business was booming, and that the hotels organised spiritual tours for tourists. So it's become very commodified, and along with many other things in Bali, which is
can we move on to an even more serious topic, really, the question of religious fundamentalism and the growing threat that poses in Indonesia. How big is that threat, do you think? And what sort of impact does it have on the country?
Well, I think that it's huge. And in my time in the country, I saw a huge swing to religious fundamentalism. The country has always prided itself on being a moderate Muslim majority nation, but its pluralist features changed after massive protests in Jakarta in late 2016 incited Islamic extremism. The protesters demanded the jailing of the then Jakarta governor, Basuki Jahara Purnama, who's nicknamed Ahok, and he's a Christian ethnic Chinese. He was jailed for blasphemy in 2017, and that was a watershed moment, a fault line in Indonesia's modern history. And now, political and social coexistence is really being tested with this swing to hardline conservative Islam and restrictive piety. It's a very dangerous situation, which is sort of underpinned by Saudi Sunni Islamic interests as well. And socially, culturally, and religiously, the country has changed. There's diminished freedom of expression, driven by intolerance and identity politics. And it is sort of pushed by these such hardline groups as the Islamic Defenders Front, or the FPI as they call it, whose aim is an Islamic state. And new laws are springing up all the time to stop freedom of expression. At the moment, it's because of social restrictions during the pandemic, this hardline movement seems to be more subdued, but it hasn't disappeared. I think the economy has contracted and people are just so anxious and concerned about unemployment and instability. But the danger is that, there could be a resurgence of political violence and greater civil unrest because people are unemployed and there is this instability. The president, Joko Widodo, who's known as Jokowi, he was always viewed for ages as the great reformist hope when he was first elected in 2014. And he's the first president without ties to the military or political elite, but he's increasingly been seen as weak. And then, you know, in much to people's shock, in 2019, in his bid for a second term, he picked a hardline Islamic cleric called Maruf Amin as his running mate to bolster his Islamic credentials. So that was a real shock to sort of see Jokowi turning over to this, or sort of almost buckling to this kind of Islamic fundamentalism.
What do you think the chances are of Indonesia becoming a hardline Islamic state in the future?
Look, I think it's already, you know, it's already happening, but I think it's just that the pandemic is keeping it in check at the moment, and I think people would just have to see how it's really uncertain. Everything is very uncertain there at the moment, and the pandemic has, there's a huge toll on, you know, that the numbers of deaths are the highest in Southeast Asia, and they're almost the highest number of cases there. So really, I think and throughout this, bizarrely, Jokowi tends to have his priorities on the economy rather than the pandemic. So they have a lot of problems at the moment, and it is really uncertain as to how it will progress the country. But I hope it won't. I hope that these hardline groups will not have too much influence.
Let's just return to Bali for a moment. You talk about the rampant overdevelopment in Bali in your book. You also talk about environmental disregard. Now you've got the pandemic, a lot of people dying on the island. How do you see the future of Bali? I mean, what does it need to do to recover from all these problems, all these issues?
Yeah, well, I think again that's a really hard question, and about 60% of Bali's hotels are closed, and the island is the hardest hit economy in Indonesia because of its tourist dependency, and it's unclear when the island will open to tourists again, to international tourists. I've often asked during other disasters when tourists deserted the island, why Bali doesn't, I've asked officials, why doesn't Bali develop another industry so they're not completely dependent on tourism? Nobody ever seems to sort of answer that question. I don't see the current model as sustainable. Many, after the environmental degradation and it's just not. During the pandemic, many locals started going back to the rice fields as they have done in other disasters because there's nothing for them to do. But this time it's different because it's an ongoing thing. I don't believe that's the answer, though. For a start, most of the rice paddies don't even exist anymore. But I believe sustainable options, especially free education and vocational training, should be pushed to be able to sort of develop perhaps another industry and attain more of an equitable quality of life for people. There's so many poor people out there. Yeah, and it's I just I think there are probably lots of, mean, I see IT as perhaps one area that they could develop. Yeah, but it is difficult. It's very uncertain.
You've obviously got a good relationship with Bali and the Balinese. Are you yourself optimistic about the future and whether things can ever return to a degree of normality there?
The way I've been away for a year. I hear it's very quiet. I don't know. I don't see people returning, especially Australians, for a long time. I know that they are trying to develop a kind of a tourism corridor for people at the moment, and people, international travellers who would be vaccinated before they come in, and then have tests when they come in. But I just don't see that as a long-term viable answer, because so yes, it's very hard to say what the future will be there.
Is it possible that the pandemic could be some kind of wake-up call in a way that might put a stop to the environmental disregard, as you refer to it, and the rampant overdevelopment? It might put a pause on things.
Yeah, I think some of the development has just already ruined parts. Certainly in the south, they've excavated a lot of limestone cliffs and left huge holes, and sort of developed. They put huge hotels, resorts there, which are like the size of small cities. So even if there's no patrons, or these hotels don't open anymore, they've still ruined the environment. I also know that in north of Kuta, in this very trendy expat area called Canggu, which is very, very popular, I've heard that they are still building. I don't know what they're building, but because the shops and restaurants are sort of cheap by jowl as it stands. But I suppose it's something that they still, apparently there are a lot of migrants from other places in Indonesia. They're coming, and a lot of them are labourers.
It'll soon be time to wrap up this conversation, but let me ask you one final question about your book. And what is the main message you think that your book says about Indonesia and about Bali in particular?
Look, as I said, it's a sort of a journey, transformative, and a perspective of an impressionist perspective, really, of the country. I think it's a beautiful country. I really did fall in love with it, and I think most people who live there long enough will say the same thing. But I think they have to be pretty careful with the way they go about their, especially about this fundamentalism. That would be a huge issue to be careful of. I think the problem is, of course, there's a lot of corruption there. There's not, lots. There's not good education. There's not enough health resources. It's a vast archipelago, and geographically, it's very difficult to reach people with education, with health, with but nevertheless, it's a very addictive place, and I would like to see it really doing much better with this pandemic.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Deborah. It's been a most illuminating conversation. We've only touched on the issues, really. There's so much more to talk about if we had the time. But thank you very much indeed for talking to us this evening. Deborah Cassrels' book is called Gods and Demons. It's published by ABC Books and sells for $34.99. As I said at the beginning of this program, it's an extremely good read, which you won't want to put down. Thank you very much indeed to Deborah.
Thank you very much, Roger.
And thank you very much to all of you who've tuned in to listen to this program. Thank you very much and goodbye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Yes.